The shot rang out across the Colorado dust like a thunderclap on a clear afternoon, and every soul in Dry Creek Gulch knew that before sundown, something in this town was going to change forever. The year was 1874, and the town of Dry Creek Gulch sat pressed against the eastern slope of the San Juan Mountains like a tired man leaning on a fence post. It was the kind of place that had sprung up fast, the way all boomtowns did, with more ambition than sense and more saloons than churches. A single main street carved itself through the center of town, flanked on both sides by weathered wooden storefronts that sweated in the late summer heat. The mercantile, the post office, the livery, the barber, and at the far end, glowing amber in the early evening like a lantern hung by the devil himself, was the Silver Spur Saloon. It was the most permanent-looking building on the street, as though it had been there before the rest of the town and would remain long after the rest had blown away. Elara Voss had not chosen Dry Creek Gulch so much as she had survived her way into it. At 22 years old, she had already lived more hardship than most women twice her age. She had come west from Missouri 2 years prior with her father, a hopeful man named Gerald Voss, who had read too many newspaper articles about silver strikes and believed every word of them. Gerald had worked the mines for 14 months before a collapse had taken him one cold February morning, leaving Elara with $40, a half bag of cornmeal, and a stubborn refusal to be defeated. She had taken a position at the general store, owned by a kind widow named Mrs. Hobart, learning the business quickly. And now she ran the place almost entirely on her own, since Mrs. Hobart's eyesight had deteriorated to the point where she could barely distinguish sugar from salt. Elara was not the kind of woman who turned heads in the conventional sense, though she turned them nonetheless. She was slender and strong-boned, with dark chestnut hair that she pinned up each morning with the kind of efficiency that left no room for vanity, and brown eyes so deep and honest that people who met her gaze often felt oddly compelled to tell her the truth. She wore practical dresses, always clean despite the dust that coated everything else in the gulch, and she moved through the town with a quiet self-possession that the rougher elements of Dry Creek Gulch mistook, sometimes dangerously, for invitation. That particular evening in late August, the heat had not broken even as the sun began its descent behind the mountains. The sky to the west had gone the color of hammered copper, and the air smelled of horse sweat and pine resin drifting down from the higher elevations. Elara had stayed late at the store to complete an inventory of the incoming supply wagon, ticking off bags of flour and bolts of calico by the light of a single lantern. When she finally locked the front door and stepped onto the boardwalk, it was past 8 in the evening, later than she had intended, and the main street of Dry Creek Gulch had taken on its nighttime character entirely. The Silver Spur was already roaring. She could hear it from the end of the block, the tinny piano struggling beneath the weight of men's voices, laughter sharp and ragged as broken glass, boots hitting the floorboards with rhythmic thuds that she could feel through the soles of her own shoes. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, not because she was cold, but because it felt like a kind of armor, and started down the boardwalk toward the boarding house where she rented a small room from a German couple named the Richters. She had to pass the Silver Spur to get there. She always had to pass the Silver Spur to get there, and most evenings it was nothing more than a wall of noise she moved past quickly, eyes forward, jaw set. Most evenings. This was not most evenings. The doors of the saloon swung open with a bang as she drew level with it, and 4 men spilled out onto the boardwalk in a loosely organized collapse of limbs and laughter. They were cowboys, or at least they dressed the part, with trail-worn hats and dusty boots and the hollow, overlit look that too much whiskey gave a man's eyes. The one at the front was the tallest, a broad-shouldered man with a red bandana around his neck and a grin like he had invented the concept of trouble personally. His name, as Elara would learn later, was Dale Crisp, and he rode for the Fenwick cattle operation about 12 miles south of town, a sprawling, badly managed outfit whose owner kept his men well stocked with pay and poorly supervised. Dale Crisp saw Elara the way a hungry man sees a plate of food, with an immediate consuming sense of entitlement. "Well now," he said, and the other 3 men arranged themselves loosely behind him with the practiced ease of men who had done this kind of thing before. "Evening, miss." Elara did not stop walking. "Evening," she said, keeping her voice even, her eyes on the distance. "You're that girl from the store," Dale said, stepping sideways to occupy more of the boardwalk. "The pretty one." "I work at the store, yes," Elara said, and she stepped to the left to go around him, but he moved with her, casual and deliberate, and her stomach tightened. "Now where are you going so fast?" he said. "Evening's young. Me and the boys are just getting started. You could join us." He said it the way a cat might invite a mouse into a hole. There was nothing polite about the invitation beneath the surface of it. "I am going home," Elara said. "Excuse me." She moved to step around him again, and this time one of the other men, a shorter, thick-set fellow with a patchy beard, moved to block her path from the other side. She stopped walking. The boardwalk felt very narrow suddenly. "Don't be unfriendly," Dale said, and he reached out and caught the end of her shawl. "We're just having a conversation." "Take your hand off my shawl," Elara said quietly. Her voice was steady, but her heart was beating very fast, and she glanced down the street in both directions, looking for someone, anyone. But the street was empty in the particular way that trouble makes it empty, everyone suddenly finding reasons to be elsewhere. Dale did not take his hand off her shawl. Instead, he stepped closer, and the other two men who had not yet spoken began to drift in, and the night felt much smaller than it had a moment before. The lamplight from the saloon windows painted everything in that sickly amber color, and Elara became very aware of how far away every door was. "Let me go," she said, louder this time, and her voice did not shake, but she wished it did not have to be her saying those words at all. It was at that precise moment that the sound of the boots on the boardwalk reached them from the far end of the street. Not hurried boots, not running boots, but slow and heavy and utterly deliberate, the kind of footsteps that carried their own kind of announcement. Every head turned. He came out of the shadow at the end of the street the way something out of the wilderness comes into the light. All contained power and unhurried intention. He was enormous in the way that mountains are enormous, not just tall but substantial, built across the shoulders and chest with the kind of muscle that comes from years of genuine physical labor rather than any vanity. His hair was dark brown, longer than most men wore it in town, falling past his collar in loose waves that had clearly not seen a barber in some time, and his jaw was covered in several days of heavy stubble that was working toward becoming something more permanent. He wore buckskin trousers and a loose linen shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and his forearms, visible in the lamplight, were roped with muscle and crossed with old pale scars that spoke to a life lived close to the edge of things. He had a rifle slung across his back, but it was his hands that drew the eye, large and calloused and hanging at his sides with a stillness that was somehow more threatening than any gesture of aggression. His name was Callum Deane, and he had come down from the mountains 3 days ago to resupply before the first snows made the high passes impassable, which would not happen for another 6 weeks, but which he planned for with the same patient foresight he applied to everything. He did not like towns. He did not like the noise or the smell or the way people crowded up against each other like cattle at a trough. He had a camp outside the gulch where he kept his mule, a bad-tempered animal named Senator, and he visited Dry Creek Gulch twice a year for supplies and otherwise wanted nothing from civilization. He had been walking back to his camp from the livery when he saw the 4 men surrounding the woman on the boardwalk, and he had felt something shift in the center of his chest, the way a boulder shifts at the beginning of a slide. Dale Crisp noticed him about halfway down the block and straightened up with the alcohol-fueled confidence of a man who had not yet suffered sufficient consequences in his life. "This is a private conversation, friend," he called out. Callum did not respond to this. He walked the remaining distance at the same steady pace and stopped about 10 feet from the group, and he looked at each of the 4 men in turn with the unhurried assessment of someone who is genuinely not afraid, which is a different thing entirely from someone who is pretending. Then he looked at Elara. "You all right, ma'am?" he said. His voice was low and unhurried, with a roughness to it like gravel in a stream, and he spoke to her first, which registered somewhere in the back of her mind as something rare and decent. "These men are blocking my way home," Elara said, and her voice was perfectly steady now, bolstered by something. Callum looked at Dale again. "Step aside," he said. Simple as that. No ceremony, no threat, just the words. Dale Crisp was drunk enough to be brave, and sober enough to feel the flicker of something like apprehension, which he immediately buried in whiskey-fueled indignation. "And who the hell are you to be giving orders?" he demanded, and he let go of Elara's shawl to square himself up to his full height, which was still several inches shorter than Callum and considerably less wide. "Step aside," Callum said again, and there was something in his voice the second time that was different from the first, not louder but deeper, like the moment before thunder. What happened next was quick and decisive and left very little room for argument. Dale Crisp made the mistake of reaching for Callum's shirt front, perhaps intending to shove him or perhaps intending something more serious, and Callum caught Dale's wrist before it arrived, turned it with a motion that was almost gentle in its economy of effort, and used the resulting leverage to guide Dale Crisp firmly off the boardwalk and into the dusty street below with a thud that knocked the wind clean out of him. The whole thing took perhaps 3 seconds. The second man, the thick-set one with the patchy beard, charged from the side, and Callum turned to meet him with a forearm that stopped the charge entirely and an open-handed shove that sent the man stumbling back into the saloon's hitching post. He sat down hard against it and seemed to decide that was a reasonable place to stay. The third man threw a punch that Callum leaned away from with a slight movement, let it miss his face by an inch, and then caught the man by the collar and set him aside on the boardwalk the way you might set aside a chair that was in your way. The man sat where he was placed, blinking with the slow confusion of someone who has just discovered that the world contains forces larger than his previous experience suggested. The fourth man, who had said nothing throughout the entire encounter, took one long look at Callum standing in the lamplight above his 3 fallen companions and made the only sensible decision available to him. He went back into the saloon. The whole thing was over in under 30 seconds. Dale Crisp was sitting in the street with his hat knocked sideways and his dignity considerably reduced, looking up at Callum with a complicated expression somewhere between fury and the dawning recognition that he had encountered something he did not know how to defeat. Callum looked back at him with an expression that was not unkind, but contained absolutely no apology. "You'll sleep it off," Callum said to Dale, "and tomorrow you will not bother this woman again, or anyone else's woman either." Dale opened his mouth, then closed it. Then he picked up his hat, got himself upright, and walked off down the street without looking back. The other 2 men collected themselves in the way that deeply embarrassed men do, with much unnecessary adjustment of clothing and hats, and followed. The boardwalk was quiet. Elara became aware that she had been holding her breath, and she let it out slowly. Her hands, she noticed, were trembling slightly, the aftershock of fear that had not been allowed to express itself during the moment itself. She clasped them together at her waist and looked at the man standing a few feet away from her, who was watching the retreating cowboys with the same calm attention he had brought to the entire proceeding. He turned and looked at her, and up close she could see that his eyes were a startling shade, a clear, pale gray-green, the color of water over river stones, set beneath dark brows and surrounded by fine lines carved by wind and sun and years of squinting into distance. There was nothing threatening in them. There was something else, something alert and genuinely concerned, and she felt the trembling in her hands ease slightly under the weight of that look. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No," she said. "No, I'm not hurt. Thank you. She paused, because what she wanted to say was that she had never in her life been so glad to hear the sound of footsteps, but that felt like too much to say to a stranger on a boardwalk in the dark. "Thank you," she said again. He nodded once as if thanks were something he received infrequently and was not entirely sure what to do with. And then he did something that she would carry in her memory like a pressed flower, intact and precise, for a very long time afterward. She had been wearing her hair pinned up, as always, but the commotion had displaced one long strand that had worked loose from its pin and fallen across her cheek. She had not even noticed it. But he noticed it. He reached out very slowly, giving her every opportunity to step back, and with a finger that was enormous and calloused and thoroughly gentle, he tucked that single strand of hair back behind her ear. He did it the way you handle something you recognize as precious, with a care so completely at odds with everything else about him, all that contained strength and mountainous self-sufficiency, that it stopped her breath entirely. His hand dropped back to his side. "You should get home," he said quietly. "It's late." "Yes," she said, because it was the only word she had available. She walked home in a state that she could not have accurately named, something between gratitude and astonishment, and a warmth that had absolutely nothing to do with the lingering August heat. She lay awake in her room at the Richter's boarding house for a long time that night, staring at the ceiling while the sounds of the sleeping town filtered through the thin walls, and she thought about gray-green eyes and the particular gentleness of a man who did not need to be gentle. Callum Deane was back at his camp by the time the town had gone fully quiet, sitting outside his tent with Senator picketed nearby, eating cold beans and staring into the small fire he had built for the light of it, rather than the heat. He was not a man given to lengthy introspection. He had spent too many years in places where thinking too much about anything other than the immediate practical situation was a luxury that could get you killed. He thought in concrete terms, in the language of weather and terrain, and the practical management of survival. But he found himself thinking about the woman, about the steadiness in her voice when she had told those men to let her go, about the look in her eyes when he had come down the street, not the flinching relief he might have expected, but something more measured, an honest gratitude that had not tried to perform itself. He thought about the way she had stood her ground, even when the ground was shrinking, and something about that struck him as admirable in a way he could not immediately explain. He told himself it was nothing. He was leaving in 3 days. He had supplies to gather and a route to plan and a winter cabin in the high country that needed 3 more cords of wood split before the first serious snow. He had no time and less interest in any complication that a town could offer him. He believed this completely. He did not sleep well. The next morning, Elara opened the store at 7 o'clock as always and began the business of the day with the methodical competence that had become her armor and her comfort. Both. Mrs. Hobart came down from her rooms above the store at 8, moving carefully with her poor eyesight and her arthritic joints, and settled into the chair behind the counter with a cup of tea and a proprietary air, and the 2 women worked in the quiet, easy partnership they had developed over 2 years of mutual necessity. The morning passed the way mornings did in Dry Creek Gulch, with a succession of familiar faces and familiar needs, the miners wanting lamp oil and tobacco, the ranchers' wives wanting fabric and thread, the occasional drifter wanting something to eat, and the look in their eyes that said they were hoping credit might be an option. Elara managed all of it with the smooth efficiency of someone who had learned that a well-run store was its own kind of argument against the roughness of the world. She did not expect him to come in. She had thought about it, admittedly, once or twice in the early morning when her mind had wandered from the inventory, but she had not really expected it. The bell above the door rang at 10:30, and she looked up from the bolt of calico she was measuring, and there he was. In the daylight, he was even more impossibly large. He had to duck slightly to clear the door frame, and when he straightened up inside the store, he seemed to reduce the available space considerably, the way a tree in a small room would. He was wearing the same buckskin trousers and had added a battered leather vest over the linen shirt, and his long dark hair was tied back loosely with a piece of rawhide in a concession to practicality that somehow made him look more himself rather than less. He carried a list in one large hand, a piece of paper that looked comically small in his grip. He looked around the store with a slight narrowing of his eyes that she recognized as a man orienting himself to a new space, and then his gaze found her. And for just a moment, just the very briefest interval, something crossed his face that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. "Morning," he said. "Good morning," she said, and she set down the calico with a composure she was moderately proud of. "Can I help you find something?" He came to the counter and set down his list, and she leaned over to look at it. It was a careful list, precise and economical, written in a large angular hand. Coffee, salt, dried beans, cornmeal, beeswax, 2 coils of rope, lamp oil, a block of lead, powder. The materials of a man who was going somewhere remote for a long time and had done it before. "I have most of this," she said. "The lead and powder you will want at the hardware store. They do better on those. But everything else I can set aside for you." "I appreciate it," he said. She began pulling items from the shelves, and he watched her with the same attentive stillness that she was beginning to recognize as a characteristic of him, a general quality of undivided attention that most people reserved only for things they found important. She was not sure what to make of being looked at like that. "I did not get your name last night," she said, because the silence had gone on a certain length, and she was not a woman who was afraid of beginning a conversation. "Callum Deane," he said. "Elara Voss," she said. "I own this store more or less. Mrs. Hobart owns it legally, but she's a good deal less involved than she used to be." She said this without bitterness, simply stating the arrangement. He nodded. "You run it well," he said. "I have been in here before. 2 years ago, maybe. Different person behind the counter." "That would have been Mrs. Hobart herself," Elara said, before her eyes got worse. She set a bag of coffee on the counter. "You come down from the mountains?" "Above Castlefort Creek," he said, "about 3,000 feet up." "That's a long way to come for coffee and cornmeal." The corner of his mouth moved. She could not tell if it was a smile or just a reaction, but she filed it away. "Long way to go without them," he said. Mrs. Hobart chose that moment to emerge from the back room with her tea, moving slowly, and she stopped when she perceived the large shadow at her counter. "Oh my," she said, which under the circumstances Elara felt was entirely understandable. "Mrs. Hobart, this is Mr. Deane," Elara said. "He is here for supplies." "Mountain man," Mrs. Hobart said, in the tone of someone making a simple identification, the way you might say blue sky or brown horse. She peered at Callum with her clouded eyes. "You look sturdy." "Yes, ma'am," Callum said with a gravity that Elara found unexpectedly endearing. "Good," Mrs. Hobart said, as though this settled something, and she went to her chair. Elara finished gathering the items on his list and wrote out the total on a slip of paper, and Callum counted out the coins from a pouch with the careful deliberation of a man who keeps track of every cent, not from poverty, but from principle. He picked up the wrapped package and made as if to go, and then he paused. "I want to say," he began, and stopped, which surprised her because he did not seem like a man who stopped in the middle of sentences. He looked at the counter for a moment, then back at her. "What those men did last night was not right, and I'm sorry you had to deal with that." "You do not need to apologize for someone else's actions," she said gently. "No," he said, "but I wanted you to know that not everyone in this town thinks a woman walking alone at night is an invitation." There was a silence that was not uncomfortable but was very full, the way certain silences are, charged with more than the words that surrounded them. "Thank you," she said, "for last night, and for saying that just now." He nodded once, picked up his package, and went to the door. He paused there with his hand on the frame, and she had the sense he was about to say something else, but instead he just said, "Good day, Miss Voss," and ducked through the door into the bright morning. She stood for a moment looking at the space where he had been. "He'll be back," Mrs. Hobart said from her chair, with the calm certainty of an oracle. "Mrs. Hobart," Elara said, turning back to the calico. "I have been alive for 63 years, Mrs. Hobart said. I know when a man comes into a store for supplies and when a man comes into a store." Elara chose not to dignify this with a response, which Mrs. Hobart correctly interpreted as agreement. He was back that afternoon. He told himself he needed another coil of rope, which he did not strictly need, and that the rope he had purchased that morning had been the wrong gauge, which it had not been. But he walked back into the store at 3 in the afternoon with the coil of rope in his hands and the particular focused expression of a man who is pretending a thing is simpler than it is. Elara was alone in the store, Mrs. Hobart having gone upstairs for her afternoon rest. She was repainting the price marks on the bins of dried goods, crouched down low with a small brush, and she looked up when the bell rang. When she saw who it was, something in her expression shifted in a way that she immediately attempted to suppress and mostly failed. "Mr. Deane," she said. "I need a different rope," he said, setting the coil on the counter and recognizing as he said it that this was one of the less convincing statements he had made in recent memory. Elara set down her brush, stood up, and looked at the rope on the counter with an expression of careful neutrality. She looked at the rope for a moment. She looked at him. "What gauge do you need?" she asked, and her voice was perfectly even. "Thicker," he said, "for rigging a lean-to." She went to the rope section without comment, selected a heavier coil, and brought it back. She set it on the counter beside the first one. She named a price. He paid it. Neither of them moved. "There is a boarding house on 2nd Street, she said, "that serves supper at 6, the Richter's where I stay. Mrs. Richter is a good cook, better than whatever you have got in that camp of yours." She said it to the counter rather than to him, which he noticed. "I have been eating cold beans," he confirmed. "Then you should eat at the Richter's at 6, she said. He looked at her for a moment with those clear, pale eyes. "I should," he said. He was at the Richter's front door at 6 o'clock exactly. Mrs. Richter, a stout and cheerful woman with an Austrian accent that had survived 3 decades on the American frontier, largely intact, opened the door, took in the full 6'3", 240-pound reality of Callum Deane standing on her porch, and broke into an enormous smile. Come in," she said. "We have plenty." The boarding house dining room was a simple place with a long table that seated 12 and a fireplace at one end that was cold in the summer heat. There were 4 other boarders that evening, 2 miners named Pfeiffer and Jacobs who were polite and largely uncommunicative, a traveling dry goods salesman named Turner who made up for the miners' silence with more than enough conversation of his own, and an elderly schoolteacher named Miss Calhoun who had come west to establish a school and had not yet lost her optimism about the project. Callum was seated across from Elara. The dinner was roasted pork with potatoes and a bean soup that was everything his cold camp beans were not, rich and properly seasoned, and he ate with the sincere appreciation of a man who has been living on his own cooking for 6 months. He said little during the meal, which was not unusual for him, but he listened with a genuine attention that Elara noticed, and the traveling salesman Turner mistook for an invitation to hold court. Turner talked about tariffs and rail lines and the price of goods in Denver, and Callum listened to all of it, but his eyes returned to Elara at regular intervals that she pretended not to notice. After dinner, Mrs. Richter served coffee, and the other boarders drifted away to their various rooms or to the parlor, until it was only Callum and Elara left at the long table. Mr. Richter, a quiet man with a magnificent mustache, appeared briefly to collect the coffee cups and then disappeared again with the tact of someone who recognized a situation. "You've been up in those mountains a long time?" Elara asked. 11 years, Callum said. "Since you were what, 20? 21, she calculated. "So you're 32. He nodded. "What took you up there in the first place?" He was quiet for a moment, not evasively but in the way of someone who is deciding how honest to be. "I was a soldier," he said. "Union Army. I was in it from the age of 17 until the end of the war. After the war, I could not—" He stopped and looked at his coffee cup. "The towns were too loud," he said. "Too much of too many things happening at once. I needed somewhere that was quiet in the right way." Elara looked at him steadily. She understood, in the way that people who have also needed distance from painful things understand it, without requiring the full accounting. "And the mountains were that," she said. "The mountains were that," he said. "Still are. Do you ever miss—" She hesitated. "People?" He considered this with his characteristic honesty. "There are things I do not miss about people," he said. "But there are things I have—" He paused again. "Wondered about," he finished, and the words carried a weight that suggested they were proxies for something larger. "What things?" she asked quietly. He looked at her then, a direct and unguarded look that she had not expected and that made her breath do something inconvenient. "Dinner," he said. "This kind of dinner, with someone worth talking to." The silence that followed that statement was very warm and very specific. "I'm glad you came tonight," she said. "So am I," he said, and there was nothing in his voice but the plain truth. They sat there for another hour, Mrs. Richter reappearing periodically to refill the coffee with a strategic innocence that deceived absolutely no one, and they talked. They talked about his life in the mountains, about the way the seasons worked at high elevation, about the particular light in winter when the snow was deep. He talked about trapping and hunting, about the occasional trading he did with various mountain men and prospectors he knew, about the solitary industry of his days. He listened to her in return, and she found herself telling him about her father's death, about the 2 years she had spent building something from almost nothing, about the stubborn and sometimes angry determination that had kept her in Dry Creek Gulch, when the easier thing would have been to go back east. He did not offer her platitudes or excessive sympathy. He listened with that total attention of his, and when he spoke, what he said was real. "Your father would be proud," he said, "of what you built." She looked at the table. "I hope so," she said softly. When he finally stood to leave, hat in hand, Mrs. Richter appeared from nowhere to show him to the door, with the beaming inevitability of a matchmaker who can already see exactly how this ends. He said goodnight to Elara at the foot of the stairs, and she said goodnight, and they looked at each other in the way that people look at each other when they know something has shifted and are not yet sure what to do about it. He walked back to his camp through the warm dark and sat with Senator for a while, the mule regarding him with the deep philosophical indifference of his kind, and Callum thought very clearly and without any attempt to qualify it, he was not leaving in 3 days. He would need more time in town, for supplies, for practical reasons. He told himself this with a straight face. He stayed in town. The 3 days became 5, and the 5 became 8, and each day he found his way to the general store in the morning on some reasonable pretext, and each evening he appeared at the Richters' front door for supper, and after supper he and Elara sat at the long table and talked, or walked in the early evening air up and down the main street and talked, and something between them was building the way things build when you are watching from inside the process, slowly enough that each individual moment seems unremarkable, but fast enough that looking back, you can see very clearly where it was going. On the 9th day, Del Crisp came back. He came alone this time, which was either a sign of courage or foolishness, and he was sober, which was worse in its way because it meant the anger was deliberate. He came into the store when Elara was alone and stood in the center of it with his hat in his hands and an expression that was trying to compose itself into something acceptable and not quite succeeding. "I came to apologize," he said. Elara looked at him from behind the counter with an expression that gave away nothing. "All right," she said. "What we did the other night was—" He stopped, and the word that should have gone there seemed to give him physical difficulty. "Wrong," he said finally. "Yes," she said simply. He turned his hat in his hands. He was younger than she had first thought, perhaps 25, and there was something worn and unhappy in his face that she might have felt sorrier for under different circumstances. "That mountain man," he said, and his voice tightened slightly. "He a friend of yours?" "Why do you ask?" she said carefully. Dale shrugged, a tight, controlled motion. "Just wanted to know what I'm apologizing into," he said. "Whether you've got protection or whether you're just—" "Whether I'm just unprotected," she said. "And therefore what? Fair game?" He had the grace to look away. "No," he said. "Mr. Crisp," she said, "I do not need a man standing behind me for my no to mean no. I told you and your friends to leave me alone. That should have been sufficient." "Yes, ma'am," he said, and for the first time he sounded genuinely abashed rather than performing it. "Now," she said, "was there anything you needed from this store?" There was not, and he knew it, and he left. She watched him go and then turned back to her work, but her hands were not quite steady, and she noticed that. She noticed the way the encounter had reached back into her chest and tightened something that had been beginning to relax, and she did not like it. She did not like that a man's apology could still feel like a threat, that she had to run the calculation of whether she had someone standing behind her. It was a small unfairness in the long list of small unfairnesses that the world arranged specifically for women, and it wore at her. When Callum came in that afternoon, she told him about it with the matter-of-fact tone she brought to things she was working through. He listened without interrupting, leaning against the counter with his arms crossed, and his expression through the whole of it was a careful, controlled stillness that she recognized by now as the expression he wore when he was genuinely upset and had no intention of showing it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Do you want me to talk to him?" he said. "No," she said immediately. "No, that's not the point. The point is—" She stopped and blew out a breath. "The point is that he asked whether I had protection, as though that is what my answer hinges on." "It is wrong," Callum said. "Yes," she said, "it is profoundly wrong." "What can I do?" he asked, and the simplicity of the question, its complete absence of defensiveness or the need to fix her problem in the way men often needed to fix things, landed differently than she expected. She looked at him. "Nothing," she said. "I just wanted to say it to someone who would understand why it is wrong without me having to explain the whole of it." "I understand," he said. She nodded. She felt the tightness in her chest ease. "Elara," he said, and it was the first time he had used her first name, and the way he said it, carefully, as though testing the shape of something he wanted to keep, made her look at him sharply. "I know I am leaving soon. I need to be back in the mountains before the serious cold sets in. That is a fact that does not change." He held her gaze steadily. "But I find that the thought of leaving is significantly less appealing than it was 2 weeks ago." The store was very quiet. Outside, someone passed on the boardwalk, boots loud then fading. "I find," she said carefully, "that the thought of you leaving is significantly less appealing than I would have expected 2 weeks ago." Something in his expression that had been held very carefully in reserve released, like a breath long held. Not a smile exactly, but the beginning of one, and it changed his whole face in a way that she had not yet seen and that struck her somewhere fundamental. "I would like to come back," he said, "in the spring when the passes open. I would like to come back and—" He stopped, and the uncertain pause from a man who was never uncertain was unexpectedly charming. "And see you," he finished. "I will be here," she said, and the space between them was full of everything that those two statements contained. He came to supper that evening and the evening after, and on his last evening in town, he asked if she would walk with him up to the edge of the tree line above the gulch, where the town fell away below and the mountains began in earnest, all massive dark pine and silver-gray granite, lit by a sky that was doing something spectacular with the last of the sunlight. They stood there together in the cooling air, looking out over the spread of the gulch below and the long sweep of the San Juan Valley beyond it, and she was aware of him standing beside her, the warmth of him, the solidity that she had started to think of as its own kind of weather, a warm front, something that changed the conditions of wherever it arrived. "It is beautiful," she said, meaning the mountains, and also meaning something else. "Yes," he said, and he was looking at her. He took her hand. It was not a dramatic gesture. He did not sweep her up or make any kind of announcement about it. He simply reached over and took her hand in his, and his hand was enormous and warm, and she felt the roughness of his palm against hers and the steadiness of his grip, and she did not pull away. They stood like that for a long time, watching the light go out of the sky. "Callum," she said. "Yes," he said. "Come back in the spring," she said. "Come back and do not leave again so quickly." "I will come back," he said, "and I will stay as long as you want me to." When he left the following morning, before the sun was properly over the mountains, she was at the store's front window watching the street. She saw him pass with Senator loaded with supplies, the mule moving with its characteristic grumbling reluctance, and Callum walking beside him. He looked up as he passed the store, and he lifted his hand, just once, a simple acknowledgement, and she pressed her hand against the cool glass of the window. The autumn settled over Dry Creek Gulch with a slow majesty that Elara had come to love despite herself. The aspens on the hillsides turned gold and then copper, and the mornings came sharp and clear, with frost on the water barrel and the particular smell of wood smoke that meant winter was taking its time, but coming nonetheless. She thought about him every day. She thought about him, and she did not diminish it or talk herself out of it, or apply the usual skepticisms that a sensible woman applies to a man she has known for less than 2 weeks. She held it honestly, the way she held everything honest, turning it over in her mind and examining it without the protective varnish of pretense. She had known him for very little time. She knew certain things about him, about his steadiness and his directness and the particular quality of care he had for things he chose to care for. She knew how she felt standing next to him. She knew how she felt in the weeks since he had gone. She wrote him a letter, which was ridiculous because she had no address for him, and kept it in the drawer beneath the counter. November arrived, and then December, and the snows came properly, piling up in the high country and dusting the lower streets of the gulch with a fine white that the horses and wagons turned to gray slush by mid-morning. Elara ordered the store's winter stock and managed the accounts and took on a young assistant, a 14-year-old girl named Clara, whose family had fallen on hard times, paying her from her own wages and teaching her everything Mrs. Hobart had taught her, because that was the only way she knew to answer the world's unfairness, by making someone else's situation a little less unfair. Christmas in Dry Creek Gulch was modest but not joyless. The town had its church, a small whitewashed building that doubled as a community hall, and the congregation gathered on Christmas Eve for a service that mixed genuine faith with the particular frontier pragmatism that colored everything out here. Elara sang in the small choir because she had a clear, true voice, and Mrs. Hobart, whose hearing was still excellent if her sight was not, insisted upon it. She looked at the candles burning in the dark church and thought of high passes buried in snow and a man in a cabin somewhere above the cloud line, and she felt something that was not quite loneliness, because it was oriented toward something rather than away from it. January and February were hard. The Gulch took the cold seriously that year, with temperatures that drove the miners indoors and froze the water barrels solid by morning. Elara kept the store open on all but the most truly dangerous days, and she and Mrs. Hobart and young Clara managed the shortened hours with a cheerful competence that the town's residents came to rely on. There was a satisfaction in being relied upon that had nothing to do with the pride of ownership and everything to do with the sense that she had put down roots here, real roots, the kind you grow in ground you have earned. March came, and with it, the first intimations of spring, the thinning of the snow on the lower slopes, the sound of water moving under the ice at the edge of the creek. Elara began watching for things without admitting to herself that she was watching. He came back on the 14th day of April. She knew it before she saw him, because Senator's distinctive complaint reached the front of the store from 2 blocks away, that particular bray of the bad-tempered mule that she would apparently have recognized in a crowd of 1,000, and she put down the bolt of fabric she was holding and walked to the front window. He looked the same. He looked exactly the same, which for some reason was a relief so profound she had to put her hand on the window frame. Long, dark hair, wider shoulders than anyone else on the street, that unhurried pace that ate distance without seeming to hurry. He was leading Senator down the main street, and he was looking at the store. He stopped when he saw her in the window. She went to the door and opened it and stepped out onto the boardwalk, and he came the rest of the way across the street and stopped in front of her with Senator pulling toward the water trough in the way of animals who have been walking all day and have their priorities straight. "You came back," she said, and her voice was quieter than she had intended. "I said I would," he said. She looked at him, standing there in the April sunshine with the San Juan Mountains behind him and the Gulch's mud and noise all around, and she thought, "This is it. This is the thing I have been orienting myself toward since August, and it is not complicated at all when you are standing in front of it." "Come in," she said. "I will make coffee." Mrs. Hobart, who was somehow always present at the exact moment required, beamed from her chair with the satisfaction of someone whose prediction has proved entirely correct. "I told you," she said to no one in particular. The following weeks were the happiest that Elara could remember in a very long time. Callum had set up camp again above town, but spent his days in the Gulch, ostensibly conducting the business of his supply trip, but in practice spending the greater part of each day in or around the general store, and the evenings at the Richter's table, and the hours in between wherever Elara was. They fell into a rhythm with the ease of 2 people who have been separately hungry for the same thing, and finally found themselves at the same table. They walked together in the evenings along the creek bank where the willows were just coming into leaf, the pale new green of them against the brown hills catching the last light. He told her about the winter, about the work of it and the silence, and the way the world at high elevation became almost abstract in the deep cold, white and blue and utterly simple. She told him about Clara, about Mrs. Hobart's health, which had been less good in the cold months, about the account books and the small victories and ordinary disasters of the store's winter. One evening in late April, sitting on the bank of the creek with the sound of the water between them and the first stars appearing above the eastern rim of the valley, he turned to her and said, without preamble, which was entirely in character, "I have been thinking about things differently since last autumn." "What kinds of things?" she asked, though she suspected she knew. "About what I want," he said. I've spent 11 years wanting a very particular and limited set of things: quiet, independence, the mountains. He picked up a flat stone from the creek bank and turned it over in his fingers. I still want those things, but I have been thinking that wanting them does not have to mean— He stopped. Does not have to mean what? She said softly. Does not have to mean alone, he said. She looked at him in the fading light. The creek ran over the stones with its small sound, and the willows moved in the slight evening breeze, and she thought how long she had been alone in the practical day-to-day sense of the word, and how different the kind of aloneness she had felt since August was, pointed and directional, aimed at something. No, she said, it does not have to mean alone. He reached over and took her hand, as he had done on the hillside in August, with the same simple directness. He looked down at their joined hands and then at her. I'm not good at this, he said, at the saying of things. You are better at it than you think, she said. Elara. He said her name with that particular care. I want to ask if you would consider. He stopped again, and this time a slight color came into his face, which from a man of his self-possession was extraordinary. I'm asking if you would consider being my wife, he said. Not immediately. I know it has not been long enough, by most measures, but I would like to spend more time here, the rest of this spring and summer, and I would like to know at the end of it if you would consider it. She was quiet for a moment. Callum Deane, she said. I stopped considering it quite a while ago. He looked at her, uncertain. I mean that I have already decided, she said, and her voice was warm and steady as the creek. Yes. When you are ready to ask properly, the answer is yes. The expression that crossed his face then was something she had never seen from him before, completely unguarded, a kind of unconstrained gladness that made him look years younger and rearranged everything about him into something that was almost boyish in its openness, and it was one of the most beautiful things she had ever seen. He brought her hand to his lips and pressed them against her knuckles, and it was not the grand gesture that a lesser man might have made of this moment, but the combination of its restraint and its sincerity made it feel larger and more significant than anything theatrical could have been. In the summer, he said. In the summer, she agreed. The weeks that followed were a courtship conducted at the pace of the frontier, practical and earnest and deeply felt beneath the practical surface of it. He spent May helping with the store, which he proved surprisingly capable at despite his stated preference for solitude, carrying heavy stock with an ease that saved considerable labor, and demonstrating a mathematical aptitude for accounting that came from years of carefully managing his own very limited resources. He learned the rhythms of the town and the store, and the town, for its part, came to know him. The reactions to Callum Deane were generally of two kinds. Some people found him overwhelming at first impression, intimidated by the sheer physical presence of him, the size and the quietness that some read as coldness. But those people, once they had a real conversation with him, universally revised their opinion. He was fair and direct and had a dry humor that emerged slowly and was all the funnier for it, and the men who worked the honest trades of the town, the smiths and the carpenters and the miners who kept their dignity, responded to him as one of their own. The second group were those who had been watching Elara and had ideas of their own, some of them benign, and some less so. These people adjusted their ideas without fuss once the situation became clear. Dale Crisp, who came into the store once in early May, took one look at the arrangement and left without incident, and was reported to have left town entirely not long after, for reasons unrelated to Callum specifically, but possibly connected to a general reassessment of the direction his life was taking. On a clear morning in the second week of June, with wildflowers filling the meadows above the gulch and the San Juans wearing their last caps of snow like elderly gentlemen with white hair, Callum asked Elara Voss to marry him properly, on one knee in the back room of the general store, with a ring he had made himself from silver wire he had traded for the previous winter, simple and precise, and obviously made by hands more accustomed to practical construction than delicate work, which somehow made it more precious rather than less. She said yes with her hands pressed to her face and her eyes bright. Mrs. Hobart, who had been entirely not listening from the other side of the thin wall, made a sound that was indistinguishable from triumph. They were married 3 weeks later, in the small whitewashed church, on a Saturday morning in early July when the valley was at its summer best, and the air smelled of sage and pine and the distant sweetness of high country flowers. The ceremony was performed by the Reverend Aldrich, a lean man from Ohio who had come west with his faith and kept it, and the town turned out for it with the generosity that frontier communities extended to genuine occasions, which were scarce enough to be treasured. Elara wore a dress of white cotton with small blue embroidery at the collar that she had made herself in the evenings over the preceding 2 weeks, her needle moving with the same competent rhythm as everything else she turned her hands to. Her dark chestnut hair was dressed more elaborately than usual, pinned up with small white flowers woven into it by Mrs. Richter, who had cried 3 times already before the ceremony started and showed every sign of continuing. Callum wore a clean dark coat he had acquired from the town's tailor, a garment that had required special accommodation for his shoulders and that the tailor had taken considerable pride in, and his long dark hair was combed back and tied at his neck, and he stood at the front of the small church like something that had been arranged there by geology rather than circumstance, solid and permanent, and utterly certain. When Elara walked up the aisle toward him on Mrs. Hobart's arm, because it was Mrs. Hobart who had been her family in this place when no other family was available, Callum's expression did something that made at least 4 women in the congregation reach for their handkerchiefs simultaneously. It was not an elaborate expression. It was simply one of complete and undisguised love, undefended and unperforming, and it crossed his face and stayed there. They spoke their vows in the clear voices of people who mean them, and when Reverend Aldrich pronounced them married and Callum took Elara's face in his huge, gentle hands and kissed her, Mrs. Richter finally abandoned all pretense of composure entirely, and nobody held it against her. The celebration afterward was held in the church hall, which had been decorated with summer wildflowers and long tables of food contributed by the town's women, and it lasted well into the afternoon with music from the fiddle player who worked the saloon on weeknights, but was thoroughly respectable on Saturdays, and dancing on the scrubbed floorboards, and more food than anyone had any right to expect. Callum danced with Elara once with a formal seriousness that suggested he had been rehearsing, and twice with Mrs. Richter, because she asked him directly, and he was incapable of saying no to a direct request from a woman who had been crying happy tears over him for 3 weeks. Elara danced with Mr. Richter and with young Clara, who had grown very attached to her over the winter, and had been a small fixture of the wedding preparations with the solemn intensity of a 14-year-old who takes such things very seriously. As the afternoon moved toward evening and the celebration wound down into the comfortable stage of full stomachs and low conversation, Callum found Elara at the edge of the hall near the open door, looking out at the golden evening light falling on the main street, and he came to stand beside her and slipped his arm around her waist, and she leaned into the solid warmth of him with the ease of someone settling into something that was exactly the right shape. "Happy?" he said. "Perfectly," she said. They had decided to spend the summer in Dry Creek Gulch, where there was a small house available to rent on the quiet eastern edge of town, 2 rooms and a good fireplace and a kitchen garden that the previous tenant had planted and abandoned. It was close enough to the store that Elara could walk to work, and it had a view of the mountains from the back window that Callum had specifically noted when they were looking at it. The house was small and clean and smelled of pine boards and dried lavender, and they made it their own with the thoroughness of 2 people who have each been without a real home for long enough to understand what one is worth. Elara hung curtains of pale yellow cloth and arranged the small collection of objects she had gathered over 2 years in Dry Creek Gulch. A few books, a tin of her mother's that had made the journey from Missouri, a small watercolor of the mountains that Miss Calhoun, the schoolteacher, had painted as a wedding gift. Callum built shelves with a precision and solidity that suggested he had been building things to last in conditions where lasting was not guaranteed, and he split a winter's worth of firewood before midsummer, a quantity that Elara found somewhat excessive, but which she later revised her opinion of when October arrived early. He was, she discovered, a man of extraordinary domestic capability when he applied himself to it. He could cook adequately and did so without complaint on the evening she was late at the store. He repaired things without being asked, with a quiet attentiveness to what needed doing that she found both useful and touching. He was also, as she was discovering in the intimacy of the shared space, possessed of a depth of feeling that he expressed through action rather than speech, through the coffee that was always ready when she came downstairs in the morning, through the way he always positioned himself between her and any potential danger without making a performance of it, through the particular way he looked at her in unguarded moments when he did not know she was watching. She did watch. She watched with the honest attention she brought to everything worth understanding. And what she saw was a man who had spent 11 years learning how to need nothing and was now unlearning that with a thoroughness that matched everything else he did. They had the summer of simple daily happiness that she had not believed, in the hardest of her 2 preceding years, that she would ever have. They walked in the evenings. They sat on the back step in the blue dusk watching the mountains change color. They ate supper together and talked about everything and sometimes nothing. And it was the nothing conversations, the comfortable silences and the inconsequential exchanges about the day's small events that she treasured most fiercely, because those were the conversations that told you something about the quality of the thing you had found. She also watched him learn the town, which was its own kind of pleasure. He was not made for towns in the long run. She knew that, and she had no wish to remake him into something he was not. But he had a genuine decency in his dealings with people that the town responded to, and a reputation that had been established thoroughly on that August evening outside the Silver Spur, and had not been diminished since. People knew who he was. They knew what he was capable of, and, more importantly, they knew what he was like when capability was not being called on, and they liked him for both. He helped the blacksmith one afternoon in August, when the man was short-handed, working the bellows with a willingness that had the smithy done in half the usual time. He assisted a family whose wagon had broken an axle on the edge of town, lifting the back of the loaded wagon while the husband replaced the wheel in a demonstration of raw strength that created a small audience. He was not showing off. He genuinely never showed off. He simply applied himself to whatever problem was in front of him with total commitment, and the application of that much capability was inevitably impressive. One evening in late August, sitting on the back step in the last of the summer warmth, Elara took his hand and held it and said, "I need to tell you something." He looked at her with full attention. "I think," she said, and she was unable to keep the wondering from her voice, "we are going to have a baby." The stillness that came over him was absolute, the way absolute stillness tends to precede very significant things. He looked at her for a moment that stretched out into something larger than a moment. Then he brought her hand to his chest and held it there against his heart, and she could feel the strong, steady beat of it. "You are certain," he said, and his voice was different, lower and rougher and full of something that she recognized as an emotion he was working very hard to contain. "Mostly certain," she said. "I will see the doctor this week to be sure, but I believe so." He was quiet for a while, holding her hand against his chest, looking out at the mountains in the gathering dark. She watched his profile, the strong line of his jaw, the slight movement of muscle there as he worked through whatever he was working through. "Elara," he said finally. "Yes," she said. "I was not—" He stopped and started again. "I did not think I would have this," he said. "Any of this. I'd come to a very settled arrangement with not having it." "I know," she said softly. "I am?" He turned and looked at her, and his gray-green eyes were very bright. "I do not have a word for what I am," he said. "It is not a feeling I have had before." "I know that word," she said. "It is called grateful." He brought her hand from his chest to his lips and pressed them there for a long moment, and she leaned her head against his shoulder and felt the mountain dark come down around them. The doctor confirmed it the following week. She was about 2 months along, he thought, which placed the birth in the spring, which Callum spent the remainder of the summer and all of the autumn quietly but comprehensively preparing for, in the way he prepared for all things that mattered, with total dedication and no wasted effort. He built a cradle from pine wood in the evenings in the small back room, working by lamplight with a care and precision that was entirely out of proportion to the visible skill required of him, because he could have built it quickly, but this was not the kind of thing you built quickly. This was the kind of thing you built as though it mattered, because it did. The cradle was simple but perfect, smooth-planed and solid, and exactly the right size, and he had carved a small design along the curved edge of it, mountains and the suggestion of trees, because those were the things he knew how to carve. He watched Elara with the attentiveness of a man who has discovered late in life that protective instinct can be directed somewhere beyond the purely physical, that watching over someone can mean the 10,000 small daily attentions that add up to a life being held with care. He insisted on carrying any heavy loads from the store. He rebuilt the back step that had been slightly uneven and therefore a minor trip hazard, which it had been all summer without incident, but which he now regarded with a seriousness that made Mrs. Richter say, when Elara reported it, that he was going to be an extraordinary father. The autumn was beautiful that year, the kind of Colorado autumn that seems designed to console you for the imminence of winter, all gold and amber, and the particular clarity of the mountain air when the humidity is gone, and the sky is a color of blue that has no name in the ordinary vocabulary. Elara's middle was rounding gently beneath her practical dresses, and she felt well, remarkably well, the nausea of the early weeks having given way to a vigorous health that she was quietly grateful for. Miss Calhoun had finally succeeded in establishing her school, a small one-room building that the town's men had put up in late September, and the sound of children's voices at lessons in the morning had added something to the town's daily music that it had needed without knowing it. Elara contributed paper and pencils and 3 primers from the store's stock without charge, and Miss Calhoun's smile at this had been worth considerably more than the cost of the goods. Clara, now 15, had become indispensable at the store, and Elara had promoted her to something very close to a partner arrangement, sharing the responsibility and a portion of the profits, with a generosity that came from knowing what it meant to have been given something by someone who did not have to give it. Clara was clever and quick and utterly reliable, and having her meant that Elara would be able to step back a little in the later months of the pregnancy without the store suffering for it. October brought the first serious cold, and with it, the renewed urgency of winter preparations. Callum, who had done this at high elevation for 11 years, had the house prepared with a thoroughness that approached military precision. The firewood stacked beside the house was a wall of split pine that would have served a house twice their size. The windows were fitted with additional insulation. The pantry was stocked with the preserved goods of autumn, jars of beans and tomatoes, and the dried herbs that Elara had gathered from the kitchen garden before the frost came for them. They sat by the fire in the evenings of October, Elara doing needlework for the coming baby, Callum reading the few books in the house with the quiet intensity he brought to anything he decided to apply himself to, and the fire made amber light on the pine walls, and Senator was stabled at the livery for the winter, and the mountains were getting their snow back, and Dry Creek Gulch settled into the colder half of the year with its characteristic grumbling acceptance. One evening in November, Callum set down the book he was reading and said, "I have been thinking about the spring." "What about it?" she said, not looking up from the needlework. "About where we should be," he said, "after the baby comes." She looked up then. "I know the store is your livelihood and your home," he said carefully. "I know what it cost you to build what you have here. I would not ask you to leave it. I want to be clear about that." "But," she said. He looked at the fire. "But there is a valley," he said, "about 2 hours below my cabin. On the eastern slope, lower elevation, not the high country. There is good water there and south-facing land for a kitchen garden and timber. It is inside a bend in the creek, so it has natural shelter." He paused. "I have been thinking about it for a long time, before I came here. I used to ride down through that valley on my way to town, and I would think—" He stopped. "Think what?" she said softly. "Think that it was the kind of place you build something that stays," he said. "I was not thinking about a person when I thought it. I was just thinking about the place. But now I think about the place, and I think about you in it, and the two things seem—" He looked at her. "Correct. Together." She set down her needlework. She thought about the store, about 2 years of work and the small kingdom of competence she had built there. She thought about Mrs. Hobart, who was not well, and about Clara, who was 15 and perfectly capable, and who needed the opportunity as much as Elara needed to give it. She thought about what she had come west for in the first place, not the store, that had been circumstance, but the thing before the circumstance, the belief that there was a life out here that was entirely your own if you were willing to make it. She thought about a valley on an eastern slope, south-facing, sheltered by a creek bend, and she felt something expand in her chest. "Would we be far from town?" she asked. "When the baby needs a doctor or supplies?" "Half a day's ride," he said, "less in good weather." "And you would build there? A proper house, not just a cabin?" "A proper house," he said, "from the ground up. I know how to build things that last." She looked at him, at the face she had been learning for months, and which she understood now the way you understand something essential, not as a collection of features, but as a whole and known thing. "Yes," she said. "Yes," he said. "Let us build a house in that valley," she said. "Let us build it before the baby comes, or begin it at least, and let us make it the kind of place you build something that stays." He reached over and took her hand, his large, warm hand over hers, and they sat looking at the fire and the future they were building toward it. The winter passed in its own way, long and cold and quiet in the particular way that winters were in the high country, but not without warmth. Elara's pregnancy moved through its months with a steady rhythm, her body doing what it knew to do, and the doctor visited monthly and was satisfied with what he found. She worked at the store until February, when the combination of the cold and the increasing bulk of her middle made the walk less comfortable, and then she turned the daily operations over to Clara with the confidence she had been building in the girl since October. Clara was ready. She stepped into the role with a composure and capability that made Elara feel several things simultaneously: proud, pleased, and mildly redundant, which she recognized as exactly what she'd been working toward. Callum was everything she had thought he would be through the difficult stretch of winter and late pregnancy, steady and attentive, and absolutely unfrightened by any of it, which she was grateful for because she had known men who found pregnancy alarming and retreated from it, and she had been aware of the possibility. He was not that man. He was present and practical and gentle, and he read the midwifery chapter in the one medical book they owned with the same focused attention he gave to tracking conditions or reading weather, treating it as a body of knowledge he needed to have because it concerned something that mattered. The baby was born on a clear, cold morning in the first week of March 1875, with the midwife Mrs. Peralta in attendance and Callum in the next room in a state of contained intensity that Mrs. Peralta could feel through the wall. The birth was long and difficult, and Elara was fierce and quiet through it, in the way she was fierce and quiet through everything hard, gripping the midwife's hand and breathing through the worst of it with a determination that Mrs. Peralta, who had attended many births, found genuinely impressive. The baby was a boy. He arrived into the world with a full head of dark hair and his father's gray-green eyes and a voice that was immediately and comprehensively apparent to everyone in the house and possibly to anyone within a block of it. Mrs. Peralta wrapped him and put him in Elara's arms and went to the door. Callum came in. He stopped just inside the door and looked at Elara, who was pale and tired and radiant in the specific way of women who have just done the most extraordinary thing, and then he looked at the baby in her arms. His expression was utterly unprotected. All of the contained, careful self-possession he moved through the world with was simply gone, dissolved by something much larger than it, and what was left was an expression of love so complete and undisguised that Mrs. Peralta, who had seen many fathers in this moment, had to look away to give it its privacy. He crossed to the bed and sat on the edge of it and looked at his son. "He has your stubbornness," Elara said quietly. Callum looked at her and his eyes were very bright. "How do you know already?" he said. "The timing," she said. This was entirely on his schedule. The corner of his mouth moved. He reached out and put one large finger in the baby's grip, and the baby's hand closed around it with the absolute conviction of the newborn, and something crossed Callum's face that was beyond words in any language. They named him Joseph Gerald Deane. Joseph for no particular reason beyond that it seemed to fit him immediately, and Gerald for Elara's father, because it was the right and the good thing to do, and because a name was a way of carrying someone with you. April came, and with it the beginning of what Callum had been planning since November. He spent 3 weeks in the valley he had described, working from before sunrise until the light failed, cutting timber from the stands of pine above the meadow and hauling it with Senator and a rented second mule, and the sound of his axe carried down the valley in the clean morning air. He had spent 11 years building and maintaining his high mountain cabin, and everything about the valley structure was informed by that experience. The way you situate a building relative to wind and sun and water, the way you lay a foundation in ground that freezes and thaws, the way you build something to breathe with the seasons rather than fight them. He rode into town in the evenings, always, coming back to the small house and to Elara and to Joseph, who was growing with the accelerating speed of the newborn young and who had begun, in the last week, to clearly recognize his father's voice and turn toward it, which had done something to Callum that he could not report on without his voice doing something inconvenient. By the end of April, the structure of the house was up. 2 main rooms downstairs and a loft above, solidly framed, with a stone fireplace that Callum had constructed with the care of a mason, though he was not one. In the second week of May, he brought Elara and Joseph out in the wagon to see it. It was a warm, blue-sky May afternoon, the kind that the Colorado high country offered as payment for the winter it had made you suffer, and the valley was everything he had described. The creek ran clear and quick along the western edge of it, and the south-facing meadow was coming into the vivid green of late spring, scattered with the yellow and purple of wildflowers, and the mountains rose on 3 sides with the particular grandeur of things that do not need to do anything to be magnificent. The house sat at the northern edge of the meadow, backed by pine, facing south into the light, solid and straight and smelling of new wood and pine resin. It was not large. It was not intended to be large. It was intended to be exactly the right size, and it was. Elara stood in front of it with Joseph in her arms, looking at it, and she was quiet for a moment. "Well?" he said. She turned and looked at him with an expression he knew by now, the particular look she wore when something had reached her deeper than she intended to show, contained and real. "It is exactly what you said it would be," she said. "It needs finishing inside," he said. "Floors, the inner walls, maybe another month." "I can help with the painting," she said. "You can help with the painting," he agreed. Joseph made a sound of decisive opinion from Elara's arms, and they both looked at him, and Callum reached over and adjusted the corner of the blanket around the baby's face, and Elara watched his enormous, careful hand at this task, and felt the whole of the life they were building settle into her like warmth. They moved into the valley house in the second week of June, 1 year nearly to the day since Callum had walked down the main street of Dry Creek Gulch on that August evening. The move was modest, a wagon load of the accumulated objects of their shared life, the yellow curtains and the pine shelves and the cradle and the books and Elara's tin from Missouri. Callum had built a proper kitchen in the back, with shelves and a good work table, and the floors were smooth-planed pine that took the light from the south-facing windows and held it. They brought Mrs. Hobart out to see it, who declared it perfectly suitable with the tone of someone who would know, and who had agreed with the arrangement of the store's ownership, transferring formally to Clara at the end of the year, which had made Clara cry for 20 minutes, and then immediately begin reorganizing the storeroom with an energy that suggested she had been waiting for the opportunity. Mrs. Hobart had moved to a new set of rooms with the Richters, who were very pleased to have her, and the arrangement suited everyone. The first summer in the valley was the kind of summer that people later described to their grandchildren as the model by which all other summers are measured. The meadow garden produced abundantly, and Elara learned the rhythm of the valley the way Callum had been learning it for years from above, the way the mornings came in, the direction the afternoon thunderstorms moved, the particular hour in the early evening when the swallows came out over the creek and the light went gold and still. Callum continued to trap and trade in the high country during the appropriate seasons, which meant he was gone for stretches of time that were long enough to be genuinely felt, but short enough to survive, and he returned from each one with the relief of a man who has confirmed that what he wants is back at the Valley House, and the knowledge made the returns better than the going. Elara held the homestead in his absence with a competence that surprised no one who knew her, managing the garden and the animals, and Joseph, who was by now mobile and opinionated and fascinated by everything in a radius of approximately 15 yards of wherever he currently was. They rode into Dry Creek Gulch twice monthly for supplies and news, and the town received them with the warm familiarity of a community that has claimed 2 people as its own, regardless of how far outside its limits they actually live. Clara's store, as it was now becoming known, was thriving. Miss Calhoun's school had doubled its enrollment. The Richters were well. Mrs. Hobart was less well, but entirely herself, opinionated and precise, and entirely unwilling to treat her age as a reason to be less forthright about anything. In the autumn of 1875, when Joseph was 6 months old and the valley was doing its spectacular October thing, Callum sat down one evening with Elara and said that he had spoken to the county registrar's office in his last trip to town and had formally filed a homestead claim on the valley land, which meant that in 5 years, when the residency requirement was met, it would be theirs entirely. He said it with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has done a practical thing that also has meaning larger than the practical. Elara looked at the certificate he had brought home, which bore both their names, hers and his, Elara and Callum Deane, Homestead Claim 1147, San Juan County, Colorado. She looked at it for a long moment. She thought about Missouri and the newspaper articles about silver strikes that her father had read with such bright-eyed belief. She thought about the collapse that had taken him and left her with $40 in cornmeal and a refusal to give up. She thought about the boardwalk in front of the Silver Spur on an August evening and the sound of slow, steady footsteps coming out of the dark, and a single strand of hair brushed back behind her ear with a care she had not expected and had never forgotten. She thought about all of it, the whole chain of it, every piece of loss and endurance and ordinary courage that had brought her to this moment, sitting in a house in a valley in the San Juan Mountains with her baby asleep in the next room and this man beside her. And she felt the full weight of the happiness of it, which was a thing you could only feel when you knew the weight of the other kind. "Thank you," she said, and she meant all of it, the whole of it. He looked at her, and she saw in his face the same thing, the awareness of the whole chain, of the man who had needed the mountains because the world was too loud, and then had found in it not a permanent retreat, but a place to become himself enough to come back down. "Thank you," he said in return, and he meant all of it too. Joseph Gerald Deane grew up in the valley on the eastern slope of the San Juan Mountains, a strong and serious and curious child with his father's eyes and his mother's direct way of looking at the world, who learned to walk in a meadow full of wildflowers and learned to speak with his mother's Missouri R's and his father's economy of word. He learned the names of the mountains and the names of the plants and the proper and respectful use of a rifle by the time he was 7, and he learned to read from his mother's careful teaching and from the 3 primers that had come from the general store in Dry Creek Gulch, and he had his grandfather Gerald's quality of believing in things, which Elara encouraged, and Callum silently considered the most valuable thing a person could have. A second child came in the autumn of 1877, a daughter they named Margaret Rose, for no one in particular, but because it sounded like her, which they knew immediately she was born. Margaret was the practical one, which Callum claimed could only have come from her mother, and Elara claimed must have come from her father, and they argued this cheerfully for years without resolution. Margaret could fix anything she could get her hands on before she was 5, and had opinions about the garden that proved correct often enough to be taken seriously. The homestead claim was fulfilled in 1880, when the land became legally and fully theirs, and Callum built the addition to the house that he had been planning since they first moved in, 2 more rooms and a covered porch along the south face that caught the morning sun and became the place where most of the important conversations of the house's life were held over the following years. Elara with her coffee and her reading in the early morning, Callum with his maps and his seasonal plans, Joseph and Margaret doing their lessons or arguing about things that seemed urgent at 7 and 9 years old. The town of Dry Creek Gulch grew and changed around them, the way all the frontier towns grew and changed in those years, with new buildings going up and old ones coming down, with the railroad arriving in 1879 and changing the pace of commerce and communication, with new families coming in and some old ones moving on. Clara's store was the most reliable establishment on the main street, grown considerably from the 2-room operation Elara had inherited, now stocking a range of goods that would have astonished Mrs. Hobart, who unfortunately did not live to see it, having passed peacefully in the winter of 1877 in her room at the Richters, with the satisfaction of a woman who had arranged her affairs well and left the right things to the right people. Elara attended the funeral and stood at the graveside in the cold December air and felt the loss of the woman who had given her the first real chance this territory had offered her, and she cried without apology. And Callum stood beside her with his arm around her shoulders, solid as the mountains at his back, in the way he stood beside her through all of the things that needed standing through. The years of the early 1880s were years of consolidation, of the homestead becoming truly itself, of the children growing into people, of the accumulation of the ordinary extraordinary substance of a life being lived fully. Callum expanded the trapping operation and added a small cattle herd, 10 head that grew to 30 and then 50, managed with the same methodical competence he brought to everything and generating a steady income that supplemented what Elara still drew from her share in Clara's store. Elara taught the children herself through their early years and then arranged for them to board with the Richters during school terms to attend Miss Calhoun's school, which by 1881 had 2 teachers and a proper building and a school bell that could be heard across most of the gulch on clear mornings. She contributed to the school consistently, with materials and with time, sitting on the school board from 1882 and arguing consistently for the education of the girls with the same thoroughness as the boys, which was not a unanimous position on the board, but which she held with a calm and unyielding persistence that eventually shifted the balance of opinion. This was a small thing and a large thing simultaneously, the way that many of the important changes in the world were made, not through grand gestures, but through a person who knew what was right, sitting in a room and saying it again and again and again until the weight of it became something the room could not ignore. On a July evening in 1883, 9 years after the night on the boardwalk in front of the Silver Spur, Callum and Elara sat on the south porch in the last of the day's light, as they had sat on 1,000 evenings, with the mountains going their extraordinary colors in the sunset, and the valley below them wearing its summer green. Joseph was 13 and had gone to bed after a day of helping with the cattle that had apparently exhausted even his considerable adolescent energy. Margaret, 10, was inside reading with the lamp burning late, which she'd been given permission for and was pressing to its limit. Elara set down her mending and looked at the mountains, and Callum, who was looking at the cattle in the lower meadow with the habit of a man who is always accounting for what is his, turned to look at her. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "I'm just looking." He looked with her. The sky above the mountains was doing the thing it sometimes did in the high summer, going from copper to rose to a deep, impossible violet at the zenith, and the first stars were appearing in the east above the dark line of the ridge, and the creek made its sound below the meadow, constant and unhurried. "Do you remember," she said, "the first night, when you came down the street?" "I remember," he said. "I heard your footsteps before I saw you," she said. "They were so certain. I heard them and I thought, whoever that is, they know where they are going." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the mountains. "I did not know where I was going," he said. "Not then, not for a long time." "And now?" she said. He looked at her, the way he still looked at her, with the same unguarded and unperforming love that had been on his face in the church on their wedding day, that had not diminished in 9 years of everyday ordinary life, but had deepened the way things deepen that are real. "Here," he said. "I know I'm going here." She reached over and took his hand, and he held it, and they sat on the south porch in the last of the light while the stars came out above the San Juan Mountains, and the valley below them went to dark, and everything that needed to be resolved was resolved, and everything that needed to be built had been built, and the life they were living was exactly what they had made it, which was the only kind of life that means anything. Behind them, through the window, Margaret's lamp burned on, and Callum Deane, who had come down from the mountains with a supply list and an 11-year-old habit of needing nothing, sat holding the hand of the woman who had changed every calculation he had ever made about what was possible, and felt, with the full and unhurried certainty of a man who has finally arrived where he belongs, the completeness of it. She looked at him in the last light, her dark chestnut hair, which still had only the faintest threading of silver at the temple, coming loose at the side the way it always did by the end of the day. And he reached over, as he had reached over on a boardwalk in August a long time ago, and tucked the loose strand of hair behind her ear. She smiled. He knew that smile entirely, the way it started at one corner before the other, the way it reached her eyes a half-second later, the way it was not a performed thing, but a simple true thing, like water or light or the sound of the creek. "You always do that," she said. "Yes," he said. He would do it for the rest of his life. He would do it when her hair went fully silver and the children were grown and gone and building their own lives in the wide continuing world, when Joseph had married and Margaret had become a school teacher, and the south-facing porch had weathered 30 years of Colorado seasons and was still the best place to sit in the evening. He would do it because it was the first real thing he had ever done for her, the first small gesture of the enormous thing he felt, and because every time he did it, he felt the whole of the distance from that August boardwalk to this porch, all that chain of chance and choice and love, present and accounted for and settled. The mountains were dark now, outlined against the stars, and the valley was quiet in the way it was always quiet, which was not the absence of sound, but the presence of right sounds, the creek and the insects, and the soft movement of the cattle in the lower meadow and the wind in the pine above the north side of the house. Elara leaned her head against Callum's shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her, and they sat in the dark of the high Colorado Valley in the summer of 1883, with nothing unresolved between them and nothing left unsaid that needed saying, and the stars above the San Juans turned their slow ancient circles overhead, indifferent to all small human things and utterly unable to diminish them.